There were two interesting trends for media in the 2000s that crossed over briefly in the latter part of the decade. Two trends that are now broadly looked at with scorn and embarrassment and produce something people really don't want to talk about anymore. Live-action anime adaptations plus licensed video games equals live-action anime video games. During the 2000s, gaming was bigger than it's ever been. The PS2, Nintendo DS, and Wii ended up becoming some of the best-selling video game consoles of all time, and still are. They all surpassed over 100 million copies sold. Video games were becoming more of a casual medium, because of their sales and because the medium was still quite cheap to develop for. So a ton of licensed games based on movies were released. This wasn't new by any means at this point, but it did feel like almost any big movie would get a licensed video game for PS2, Wii, DS, PSP, etc. Given the fact that these games were made to advertise a movie for cheap, I'm sure you can tell what the quality of most of these games were like. And over time, most of them gradually faded into obscurity until some random YouTuber talks about them because they're funny. During this time, however, there was another bizarre trend beginning to emerge as well. The first live-action Hollywood remix of anime. Anime was beginning to enter the mainstream in America this decade, and superhero movies were starting to become very successful as well. I don't really think we can directly attribute the success of movies like X-Men and Spider-Man to the rise in live-action remakes of the 2000s though, since many of those movies were in development how long before those movies came onto the scene. Plus, people in the West usually think of anime as a TV show and not the comics that come from. But what it does show is that Hollywood was beginning to make movies based on formerly niche things, and that those movies could be successful. I imagine superhero movies would have been a big influence on how live-action anime movies were made too. Anyways, they were huge flops and extremely critically panned. The live-action anime genre, whatever I call them, still has a stigma attached to it to this day. Sure, live-action One Piece, that came out, it proved they could be good, but subpar adaptations still continue to be a thing. Maybe more good adaptations could be made in the future though, now that they're seemingly on a rise. Who knows? So what happens when you combine those two trends? Live action, anime, video games. Well, an absolutely weird and obscure niche most people just want to forget about. But honestly, what about me do you think says I count as most people? I want to take a look at the video games from this forgotten cross-section, and I have 3 examples of such games to analyze, cause really, the very existence of them is odd, and it feels so localized to one era of entertainment that they're super fascinating to me. I don't get the luxury of pretending they don't exist, and neither do you now. So, here are the bizarre, the weird, and the obscure live-action video games from 2008 and 2009. Dragon Ball Evolution is a 2009 live-action remake of the Dragon Ball manga. Specifically an adaptation of the King Piccolo saga, although it is an origin story for Giku, so some liberties are taken. Actually, a lot of liberties are taken, because this barely resembled anything from the series, and the fact that its director James Wong wasn't familiar with Dragon Ball before directing it should tell you something about how bad it is. This movie was a massive failure. It just isn't fun to watch at all, not even in a so bad it's good way, and it's responsible for a lot of the stain on the concept of live-action anime in the first place. There's a lot of adaptations where one can say that the end product was flawed, but had passion in it and genuine fans working on it. Dragon Ball Evolution is not one of those adaptations, and someone was stuck making a video game out of it. Dragon Ball Evolution released for PSP a few days before the movie's Japanese and American releases. It was actually developed by Dimps, a longtime contributor on Dragon Ball video games. Dimps is almost like a shadow game developer, because they've had massive contributions developing video games but are rarely appreciated. They developed the Budokai Tenkaichi series, which are some of the most beloved Dragon Ball games out there for one. Same with the Xenoverse games. They're a big deal, even in Dragon Ball's already impressive history of video game adaptations. Dragon Ball Evolution shares a game engine and a lot of fighting game mechanics with Dragon Ball Z Shin Budokai, a game Dimps also developed for PSP, although Shin Budokai is not a Budokai Tenkaichi game, or a Budokai game. It's confusing, but basically the Japanese titles are different from the American titles, and that game has nothing to do with those other games. So you can't say that Dragon Ball Evolution is in the same line as Sparking Zero. Now, I do actually own a copy of this game, but I wanted to emulate it for footage, and this game didn't work on my PSP emulator on my laptop. As such, I'm going to be using footage from a mobile emulator, so if I'm a little bit subpar, that's certainly why. Yes, I spent actual money to own Dragon Ball Evolution for PSP. So, Dragon Ball Evolution is a fighting game based off the movie, and what I think stands out right off the bat are the visuals, just because of how weird they are. I think the menu design is fine and whatnot, but the actual in-game models of characters are really fucking funny. I mean, look at Goku. His textures look PS1 era, but they clearly tried to get the actual actor's face on him, which makes for a really funny contrast. They look quite ugly. The cutscene models don't look much better either, because they have an oddly smoothed over look to them, or it might just be that they're Dragon Ball Evolution characters, who knows. Their designs are pretty awful. Goku especially just looks so weird, and his hair is the mascot for Dragon Ball Evolution's awfulness. You do get a fairly good selection of characters to play around with who are in the movie, even if they're not exactly recognizable to their manga appearances. You can play as expected characters like Goku, Yamcha, Master Roshi, Piccolo, even Bulma, Chi-Chi, Mai, Grandpa Gohan, and who could forget this guy. King Piccolo had minions with names in the original series. They didn't have to create this abomination. Discussing characters, however, is nothing without knowing what the gameplay is like, and yeah, it's rough. You can almost tell this game was built with the skeleton of an at least somewhat competent game, because there's lots of mechanics around this game that feel like they barely contribute to the actual fighting. You have a super meter you can charge up to either use an ultimate attack or to dodge attacks, and there are a good amount of unique moves per characters. So there's at least a skeleton around the fighting system. Unfortunately, once the fighting actually starts, it's extremely bare bones, and not very engaging. It's very auto-combo focused, so it feels like it's mostly mashing buttons, maybe cancelling them into supers, meaning it's hard to actually get anything out of the combat. If you'll allow me to use a very predictable food metaphor, it's a burger where the meat's undercooked. And yes, the super moves of this game are kinda cool, but it's a fighting game experience that has all the spectacle and none of the actual gameplay to back it up.
This is it! Amazing!
I'd say the standout gameplay mode of this game would actually be the story. It's a replication of the plot of Dragon Ball Evolution using battles and cutscenes, and it's very accurate to the movie. Derogatory. Look, I don't want to deride this game just because it's based on questionable source material, but the prospect of playing the storyline of Dragon Ball Evolution is not the most exciting. There's some really cringy lines here, and the storyline just goes on, adding a whole bunch of stuff from the movie. Even if I like the movie, which I don't, it would have been excessive, because the gameplay to cutscene ratio is balanced heavily towards cutscenes. There's an excessive amount of them. Maybe like 10 battles and an hour or two of cutscenes, and I really can't stress how much the story mode yaps at you with details that are in this movie, but really don't matter. I appreciate them including a lot of content like this, but the story could have been way more brief. Like Bulma Briefs, because her name could have been Briefs. They didn't make her last name Briefs, Bulma and Kanto. Besides an arcade mode and a surprisingly in-depth story, the other real standout is probably the gallery mode of this game. You get to unlock storyboards, concept art, or set photos from the movie, which is actually really neat. I don't think I've seen many movie games do that before, and it's genuinely fascinating. It fits when this game adheres so closely to the movie. Yes, that movie was Dragon Ball Evolution, but that doesn't change the fact that it's a cool concept. Is Dragon Ball Evolution for PSP that bad? Yes, but not really. There's some enjoyment to be had in the fighting, I guess, but mostly there's not many redeeming qualities. However, it's not that bad in that it's not literally Dragon Ball Evolution the movie. I don't know, I feel like there's at least some passion in here, I guess. They tried, even if it's obvious shovelware. I know this isn't exactly much of a compliment, but since Dragon Ball Z for Kinect exists, it's not automatically the worst Dragon Ball game to ever exist. Let's look at a second example of one of these live-action anime video games, Speed Racer. Speed Racer released in May 2008 as an adaptation of the classic anime of the same name. I kind of associate Speed Racer with the West a bit, since it was very popular in America, and the anime is definitely very Hanna-Barbera inspired with its animation, so it does make sense to give it a Hollywood adaptation. It was directed by the Wachowski sisters too, so this movie was supposed to be a big deal. Unfortunately, it lost a ton of money and was very critically panned, although now a lot of people have reevaluated that and consider it great, or at least an underrated movie. Of course, I'm not talking about the movie, I'm talking about the video game. Speed Racer the video game, originally released on the Wii shortly after the movie was released. It later did get a PS2 version with more content, but I'm gonna be covering the original Wii release. Oddly enough, this game was a tactical RPG with lots of just kidding, it was a racing game. Speed Racer, the video game, on Nintendo Wii, is a deeply stupid game, but I kinda love it. This game's controls and racing mechanics are very physics-based. You can roll around on the track, spin freely, or even crash into enemies. This, combined with the fact that it's controlled by tilting a Wii remote, makes it feel like you're fighting to keep yourself in place and against rivals as you race. I don't mind it though, because the game feels built around it. The tracks are wide and you can't really fall off them. Even if you spin around, it's not hard to regain your footing and catch up to other racers to continue your little racing battle. I'm using tilt controls, motherfucker. Also, yes, the video quality is terrible, I know. Look, I'm sorry. I used an HDMI to Wii converter so I could record for my Wii, but it was $5 on Amazon, and the label literally spells converter wrong, and okay, I'll shut up. I'm sorry for the poor quality. I feel like the game definitely achieves an absolutely absurd sense of speed and chaos with a bunch of enemies going after you. Feels like a combination of F-Zero and a vehicular combat game. Not necessarily with mechanics, but absolutely in the feeling it achieves with the player. My favorite part though has to be the fact that every single time, and I mean every single time, you pass someone, they have a voice line. The face goes up at the top of the screen and they say something funny. It's so dumb, but adds to the chaos and genuinely makes it feel like a unique experience. It works well with a licensed game too, because they get to show off all the very distinct and iconic personalities of the Speed Racer cast, such as the hero, the girl, stereotypical Australian guy, stereotypical Russian one. And I will say this, over the course of me playing this game, there were no voice lines that were repeated. Maybe a few, but it wasn't noticeable. The canned voice lines actually stay fresh for most of the game. Pretty impressive for what's essentially shovelware. You can even make alliances with other racers and choose to break those alliances if you want. I don't really see the point in it, to be honest. It doesn't change gameplay in a meaningful way. You're still racing against them, and opponents don't usually try to ram into you and stuff, so it's barely noticeable what this mechanic actually does. I suppose it's a good idea though, and it especially works in a game that's so character-driven, pun intended. Unfortunately, this game has flaws. There's a serious lack of variety in the racetracks, and they don't feel like they contribute much to the actual racing gameplay. Sure, there's the occasional jump or a loop-de-loop, but it's just very hard to differentiate most of the tracks in this game besides the background visuals. Even then, lots of tracks feel the same with those visuals. Even the track itself that you race on barely changes in color. It's actually a pretty big disappointment when it feels like the tracks blend together so much. There's a lack of gameplay variety as well. There's lots of cups and races to play, but they get boring after a while. This is like a half-hour game at the very most. This game's racing isn't very deep besides the fun rush you get from it too. That can be a fine way of doing a game like this, don't get me wrong, but usually you'd expect a game focusing more on fun rather than deep gameplay to have variety so that the shallow fun is kept up for longer. Even if I have something of a soft spot for this game, it's deeply flawed and doesn't stay interesting for a long time. Speed Racer also received a port for the DS, and because the hardware was so dramatically different, it was essentially a totally different game altogether. Doing stuff like that was pretty common for the time in this era where every movie seemed to get a licensed game, and since they wanted to reach the maximum amount of people who would buy these games interested in the movie. There was even some release for the Game Boy Advance in the early years of the 2000s, so sure, I'll look at this DS version of Speed Racer 2. If I had to use one word to describe this game, it would be clunky. The racing gameplay feels similar to the console versions, but there's much less sense of speed and much less chaos on the track. The physics feel mostly the same, sure, but there's several other changes that makes it quite a different experience. For one, the way you deal with enemies is totally different. Instead of just ramming into them as you race and racing normally, once you near an opponent, you can get an opportunity to do an extremely easy, quick time event that'll knock them back with your Kart fu. I'm not joking, that's actually what they call it. This means knocking back opponents is borderline surefire, and it makes the races pretty uninteresting. It feels like you're not really racing against much competition. Opponents knocked back with Kart fu get knocked really far, so oftentimes they feel like a non-factor once you dealt with them. The big new gameplay mode of this game, however, is the fan system, where doing tricks like spinning, drifting, or Kart fu moves get people to cheer for you, and fans cheering builds up your boost meter.
I really like this idea. It's fun to spin around a ton trying to find your place as you fall to the track. You could sort of do this in the console versions, but it doesn't actively reward you as much, so it was a pretty good idea here. If this wasn't in the game, it would be much more annoying than it already is. The worst part about the races though is just that they're boring. The trick system kinda salvages it, but most of the time the game doesn't capture my interest very much. The races are really long as well, which makes it even more snooze-worthy. One race lasted a whole 10 minutes for me, which is pretty egregious when the track has a significant lack of variety. The Wii version of this game only had 2 laps per track, but for some reason in this game it's bumped up to 3. I don't really get it because the length is roughly the same. 2 was the perfect amount, and now they go on for way longer than they needed to. The audio doesn't help whatsoever. The engine is so loud that it basically drowns any other sound out, and just give this a listen. On it. This game makes your ears bleed and the pain doesn't stop. It's so awful. As for gameplay modes, there's an arcade mode and a world tour mode where you essentially just play through all the tracks and not much else. Does this game have some of the silly charm the Wii version had? Sure, I guess you can make that case, but when I think of this game, I remember how absurdly long it lasted and that horrible ambiance. Coincidentally, that's also what I remember about the last time I was at your mom's house. Now that I've covered Speed Racer, there's another 60s anime that similarly got an American adaptation. It's not live action, since it is CG animated, but it was American produced and released around the same time as Dragon Ball Evolution and Speed Racer. That is, of course, Astro Boy. Look, I like having at least 3 unique games in these types of videos, so I had to stretch my definition a little bit to do that here. I was going to talk about either this or The Last Airbender, and you'd sooner catch me dead than calling Avatar The Last Airbender an anime. The movie is a joint Hong Kong-Hollywood venture based off the classic series Astro Boy, and it was a flop. The Hong Kong-based animation studio that made it even shut down afterwards, meaning this was the last movie. They made the 2007 TMNT movie that I definitely knew about before and didn't just find from their Wikipedia page. This movie's dub did feature a pretty sad cast though. The main 2 characters are played by Freddie Highmore. On an unrelated note, I have beef with him because of the amount of people that tell me I look like the Good Doctor, and Christian Bell. They even reprise their roles in this movie. Unfortunately, I can't find if Nicolas Cage does or not. I vaguely remember seeing this movie as a kid, and from what I heard, a lot of people do say it still holds up, so I suppose it's a cult classic as well. The video game adaptation of Astro Boy was released for PSP, PS2, Wii, and DS in October of 2009. It was released on PSP first, but that was a Japan exclusive and close enough to the console versions that it's not really worth talking about. Just the Wii and DS versions are what I'll cover. Alright, this better put Omega Factor to shame. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Astro Boy is a platformer slash beat 'em up with the occasional horizontal shooter. I actually do think Astro Boy Omega Factor might have been an inspiration for it, since it's similar in gameplay to that game. Man, I should talk about Astro Boy Omega Factor someday. I need to play more treasure games. It's similar to Dragon Ball Evolution in that it's trying to be very accurate to the movie, but slightly better than Dragon Ball Evolution in that regard. There's full voice acting, and I actually found some lines pretty funny. It's an alright story, even if that's probably just because it takes stuff from the movie. It's shovelware though, of course. The character models look pretty low quality even for the Wii, and the way they interact with each other in cutscenes involves simply standing around and doing one of like 3 canned animations. This game's cutscenes look like they're made in some kind of movie maker engine for kids. Although this game is actually really funny. 90% of the reason is just because of how cheap it looks. Now, I wouldn't mind this too much if it weren't for the massive tonal dissonance it creates during certain scenes. Like, Astro Boy is a story about a boy who dies, and his father disowns him when he comes back to life because he sees him as a failure. It creates a very bizarre effect when the cutscenes look like...
Please just deactivate him and take him away. I can't bear to see his face again.
Come on, Tenma. You can't just throw him away like a piece of junk.
Dad, what's going on?
Toby, there's been a bit of a misunderstanding. You're not actually an entirely ordinary boy.
I know. Dad, I can fly. It's amazing.
Get rid of him.
What's wrong with me? Why didn't you love me anymore?
He's programmed with the memories of your own son, Tenma.
programmed?
Don't you understand?
He's not my son. He's a robot who looks like my son.
Dad,
You're a failed experiment.
There's also some points where they play movie clips that are being voiced over with new narration, and yeah, I think that should probably be a thing of the past. I just really don't like the whole vibe it has, and it takes me out of the game. It might seem weird to focus so much on this aspect of this game, but you have to understand, this is easily the most memorable part of this game, for better or for worse. Actually, I mean for worse. I'll be remembering how weird that cutscene I showed you was way after I forget everything else about this stupid game. The platforming aspects of this game are very limited, so the beat 'em up parts are most of it, and they don't exactly feel that great. The physics are oddly floaty, and fighting enemies has no spice to it, which is odd when it's such a big part of the game. The enemies deal a ton of damage, and they have a tendency to fire a lot of missiles or projectiles. The game isn't hard by any means, because checkpoints are very frequent, and there is infinite lives, but it does get frustrating when a few hits takes out so much of your life bar. You're able to fly around too, so that's how you're supposed to avoid most of these attacks, but it's not the most intuitive. Most of the time I rely on super moves during these fights, since I can use them so quickly. It doesn't exactly make it interesting when my main method of attack is a big fuck-off laser. You also have a laser attack that's not from a super move, but it's not as useful as just punching the enemy since it's very weak. I feel like it's mostly just used for shoot-'em-up sections. Those shoot-'em-up sections are somehow more boring than the actual platforming. I don't know how many times more I could say that the platforming is pretty bland. It doesn't feel like it works that well with the storyline too. Because, for example, you play through a whole level where you laser blast a bunch of cops and fly through a city, and then Astro Boy just doesn't realize he's a robot in the next cutscene. I don't even know what's going on in this game, man. Even compared to other games I discussed, it's bizarre, and that's saying a lot because one of those other games is Dragon Ball Evolution. It's not a good game by any means, but it sure is funny, you can say that much. Sometimes intentionally. The DS version is much more creative in terms of mechanics, and the visuals are definitely a lot better, but I'd argue it's even worse to play. I'll start out with the positives, I guess. Sprite work is pretty well done, the backgrounds look nice, and I enjoy the music and sound design. Although, that compliment I gave the music is hampered significantly by the fact that this game has one fucking song it plays throughout the entire experience. God damn it. The music being good at that point just makes it slightly less annoying, so it's not much of a compliment. They couldn't even get another music track for the final boss. The sound effects for when you pick up blue energy are very catchy though, and this energy system makes up the whole gimmick of this game. Basically, you get blue energy orbs from defeating enemies, and if you save them up you can do stuff like fire a laser blast, put up a shield, or heal yourself. It creates a fun system where you have to judge whether or not it's worth healing yourself or using a big attack. It's a good enough gimmick for a platformer like this, although there's one ability you use that's a rocket jump and you need it for this one area at the very start of this game. So at the literal very start of this game, you have to exit out of the level and restart this game if you miss one jump and have already killed all the enemies on screen, thus making it impossible to get more energy. Fantastic first impression. My compliments have dried up by this point because this game is similar to the Wii version and that it's got some truly awful physics and controls. It relies very frequently on beating up enemies in a bland, repetitive way. It's just as weirdly floaty as the Wii game version too, but also very stiff, and it doesn't really mix well with the oodles of enemy projectiles you'll have to dodge. There's only a few types of enemies, and the way of defeating them are essentially the same each time. It gets so tiring, especially when the game literally stops to make you beat them up. There's also an increased focus on platforming I find, and that isn't exactly congruent with the controls. It just makes for a pretty frustrating experience, one that's even worse than the Wii version. And, you know, the fact that this was forced to release the exact same day as that version probably didn't do it any favors. In case you're wondering, the cutscenes are pretty fucking awful too. There's a lot to be considered when making an adaptation, and how you preserve the original story, themes, or spirit, while building upon all of them and potentially reaching new audiences. There's a lot to be considered when making an adaptation, and how you preserve the original story, themes, or spirit, while building upon all of them and potentially reaching new audiences. But with the majority of the releases, nothing is really built upon from the source material, and inserting gameplay into their story doesn't feel like it does much for a unique experience that builds upon or changes the original work in any way, like the best licensed games do. I'm not asking for licensed game adaptations to be some breakdown of the original work, the way they can build on the original work could be as simple as it's fun and interesting. These are not, for the most part, and based on the initial critical reception, most people would argue the movies they're based on are not as well. In short, most of these live-action anime games, or I guess just video games based on American movies, based on anime, based on manga, barely justify their existence as video games, but worst of all, aren't that fun. That sounded pretty cynical, but it's worth noting these games are interesting too. I like seeing the train wreck that is licensed games, especially of this era, and it's worth appreciating how someone actually had to work on this. Most of these games at least have interesting ideas in them, and Speed Racer on Wii will probably remain a guilty pleasure video game for me. It's one of the games I actually enjoyed here. Over the course of making this video, I've also started to wonder about something. Is there ever going to be another licensed game based on a live-action anime adaptation again? I think it's an interesting thing to wonder about, because both licensed game and live-action anime seem to be on a rise. We're not quite in the era where it feels like every new movie gets a licensed game along with it, but plenty of properties are getting games in this current generation. Some bad, some surprisingly alright, but most really bad. We're also kind of seeing a repeat of the late 2000s. In that Nintendo's casual console is doing very well, even better than the Wii actually, and you know how the PS4 is still getting games for it because PS5 has no games? That's not unlike what happened with the PS2 to PS3 transition because the PS3 had no games. For the moment, I think most licensed game releases are based on nostalgic properties instead of new movies, but it's not out of the question that if a new live-action anime gets really successful, it could get a video game based on the adaptation specifically, since it would technically be a nostalgic property. Live-action anime are releasing pretty frequently too. You only need to look at McKinney's IMDb page to see the trend in action. They're still mostly not the best, but there's at least passion in them. The Yu Yu Hakusho is a good example of a series that's bad, but had passion in it. Although the One Piece live action was a great series and a massive success with more seasons to come. I'm so excited for season 2. So really, whether or not I'll have more examples of this bizarre type of game to cover depends on how the industry goes. I would love to see if we get these weird, freaky, deformed babies another time in the future. Maybe we get a skin for live action Luffy and One Piece Burning Blood 2 or Pirate Warriors 5. Maybe we get a Dragon Ball adaptation so good they have to make another fighting game for it. In the meantime, I'll be complaining that live action One Piece Season 1 didn't cover Love Town. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.